Most people enter retirement still carrying the architecture of a life they no longer need. That is one of the costliest mistakes I see. They spend 40 years accumulating a bigger house, more stuff, more obligations, more habits, more identity tied to usefulness, productivity, and being needed. Then one day they retire and they imagine peace will simply arrive because the job ended. Usually it does not. What often happens instead is that the person keeps the expenses, keeps the burden, keeps the maintenance, keeps the emotional obligations, keeps the old self-image, and then wonders why retirement still feels crowded. I have never believed that freedom comes merely from stopping work. Freedom comes when the life you built stops demanding more energy than the life you are trying to enjoy. That is a different standard. If I were talking to someone a few years from retirement, or already retired and still not feeling as light as he expected, I would not begin by asking what new investment he should buy. I would begin somewhere much less fashionable. What should you let go of? That question is under. The financial world loves accumulation. It celebrates more assets, more accounts, more insurance wrappers, more strategies, more options, more square footage, more tools, more proof. But a happy retirement is not built only by owning more. Quite often it is built by owning less, more intentionally, and with better fit. I have learned that there are two kinds of people approaching retirement. The first group still asks, am I ready? Do I have enough? Can I really stop? If that is you, confidence matters. The right decisions can widen the margin and give you more peace. The second group already knows the arithmetic is probably good enough. What they are after is quality. They want to use the early healthy years, simplify, and enjoy the life they postponed while work took the front seat. For them, the question is not whether retirement is possible. It is whether retirement will be burdened by a structure that made sense 15 years ago and makes much less sense. Now, in both cases, the answer often lies in subtraction. Not reckless subtraction. Thoughtful subtraction. I remember a couple who had done almost everything right. They worked hard, saved consistently, and entered their 60s with a respectable balance sheet and a house that had once been the perfect symbol of family life. Children, holidays, school schedules, sports gear, noise, movement. The house made sense in the middle of life. It was large enough for growth, built for activity, and full of memories. Then the children left. The room stayed, the bills stayed, the maintenance stayed, the taxes stayed, the heating and cooling stayed, the storms stayed, the errands stayed. And one day the couple realized something important. They no longer lived in a home. They were managing a museum of their former season. That is a hard thing for people to admit, because homes are emotional. A house is never only math. It contains identity, history, proof of what you built, and evidence that you did your duty. That is why so many retirees stay too long in oversized houses. They are not protecting real utility. They are protecting meaning. The problem is that meaning can get expensive. This couple loved their town. They loved walking to dinner. They loved the nearby park. They loved their church community and a handful of old friends. What they no longer loved was the work, the seasonal upkeep, the repairs, the constant sense that the property was calling for attention. On top of that, they hated winter more each year. So we stopped asking whether the house had once made sense. We started asking whether it served the life they now wanted. That is the adult question. A thing can have been right before and wrong now. They sold the house, bought a smaller place in the same area for part of the year, and used the freed capital and lower expenses to create a different rhythm for the rest of the year. Warmer winters, fewer chores, lower utilities, less worry, more mobility. What struck me most was not the math, although the math improved beautifully. What struck me was the sentence they said a few months later. We stopped being house managers and became life managers again. That sentence stayed with me. It applies to more than real estate. A great many retirees are still managing structures that no longer deserve management. The oversized house is only the most visible example. Another burden is much more emotional and therefore harder to challenge, supporting adult children at the expense of your own retirement. This is where people expect me to become cold. And I do not think the subject requires coldness. It requires honesty. Parents are wired to help. That is one of the great, beautiful instincts of life. If your child struggles, you feel it. If they want a better house, a safer car, help with bills, or a softer landing, every parental cell in the body wants to step forward. I understand that perfectly, but instinct is not always wisdom. If you are 60 or 65, your remaining healthy active years are finite, in a way your children's are not. They still possess decades to recover from mistakes, adjust their path, increase earnings, and learn through friction. You do not. That difference matters. I knew a couple who delayed retirement because their daughter needed help getting into a home. They loved her, they wanted to help, they did help, and the daughter benefited, no question. But the parents paid with time, not merely money. They traded a slice of their healthiest retirement years for a problem their daughter could likely have solved through more patience, a smaller first home, a conventional loan, or slower progress. Again, this is not about refusing all help. It is about understanding the hidden exchange rate. A parent helping an adult child is rarely giving only dollars. He may be giving years, energy, options, travel, peace, and healthful time that will never reappear once spent. Children can borrow for houses, they can rent longer, they can live more modestly, they can learn to wait. There is no bank that lends you back lost retirement years. That is why I tell people that generosity must be subordinated to structural reality. Help when it strengthens rather than weakens. Help in ways that do not create dependency or quietly punish your own future. But do not use parental love as a justification for financial self-harm. Love without boundaries can become an elegant form of denial. The same principle appears in another part of retirement that people underestimate for years. Possessions that once brought excitement but now behave like recurring invoices, boats, RVs, collections, club memberships, vacation properties, classic cars, large hobby inventories, all the expensive toys that look like symbols of success during working years and become silent consumers of capital in retirement. Now, I am not against hobbies. I am very much in favor of hobbies. A person who retires into emptiness rather than interest often declines faster than he expected. But there is a large difference between a hobby and a storage bill with sentimental branding. I knew a man who spent decades restoring old cars. Beautiful work, real craftsmanship. He loved taking something neglected and bringing it back to life. The work soothed him when his job did not. Over time, he built a remarkable collection. Anyone who saw the cars would have admired them. The problem was not the cars. The problem was the ratio between ownership and enjoyment. By the time he retired, the cars were mostly sitting. Storage costs, insurance, maintenance, registration, little repairs, time, attention, money, all flowing out to support things he drove only occasionally. His wife said something one day that finally pierced the fog. She remarked that each drive seemed to cost an absurd amount once the total annual carrying costs were divided by how rarely he actually used them. He was offended at first. That is natural. People do not like having the economics of their attachments explained to them too plainly, because here is what was really at stake. The cars were not merely machines. They were evidence of patience, skill, and years of identity. Selling any of them felt like selling a piece of himself, but after a while he saw the truth. He was keeping all of them for who he used to be, not for who he actually was now. The joy did not require the entire collection. The joy required the right part of it. So he kept his favorite, the one he genuinely loved most and actually used, and sold the others. The result was not sadness, it was relief, lower annual expenses, less mental clutter, more liquidity. One beloved object still providing pleasure instead of several dormant objects demanding service. He moved from being a collector of burden back to being an enthusiast of pleasure. That is a useful distinction. Many retirees are keeping far more than they are enjoying. Sometimes holding everything prevents you from actually appreciating anything. Cars create another retirement illusion. The second car during working years. The second vehicle may have been obviously necessary. 2 commutes, school runs, schedule conflicts, emergencies, different directions. It made sense. But retirement often changes the rhythm dramatically. No commute, fewer time collisions. More flexibility, more ability to schedule errands intelligently. Yet a surprising number of couples keep 2 vehicles simply because 2 vehicles existed before. Habit is one of the most expensive line items in retirement. A vehicle is not just a one-time purchase. It is insurance, maintenance, depreciation, registration, repairs, taxes, and the quiet little expenses that keep arriving even when the car sits doing almost nothing. I have watched retirees save meaningful sums simply by running an experiment. For 2 or 3 months, behave as though the second car is gone. Coordinate plan. Notice the frictions honestly. Then ask whether the inconvenience is real or merely assumed. Many couples discover that one vehicle, perhaps supplemented occasionally by rideshare or rental, is more than enough. They had been funding redundancy without purpose. Again, the point is not deprivation. The point is fit. Does this still fit? Retirement is a season where fit matters more than habit. There is another category people rarely price correctly because it does not arrive as a bill. Identity. This may be the hardest thing to release of all. A man retires from medicine, law, engineering, business leadership, teaching, construction, sales, public service, or any other long occupation. He thinks the challenge will be financial. Sometimes it is, but often the deeper challenge arrives later. He misses the role, he misses being needed, he misses introductions, he misses competence that the world publicly recognizes, he misses the title more than he expected. That is not vanity in the cheap sense. It is structure. For decades he answered the same question with confidence. What do you do? Then one day the old answer stops working, and he has to face a quieter question. Who am I if what I did is no longer the center? That can be profoundly destabilizing. I knew a retired surgeon who struggled with exactly this. Financially he was fine, more than fine, but he felt strangely erased in early retirement. His whole adult life he had occupied a role that commanded respect and carried immediate usefulness. Then suddenly he was no longer entering rooms with the same title on his back. He found himself volunteering, partly because he missed being recognized in the old way. Again, I understand that completely. But retirement is not meant to be a pale imitation of your working identity. It is meant to be a chance to discover which parts of you existed before the title swallowed them. That surgeon eventually found a new rhythm, mentoring family, crafts, slower conversations, teaching without urgency, grandparenthood. Pieces of himself that had been buried under professional duty finally had room to breathe. The breakthrough came when he stopped trying to continue being the old version of himself in a weakened form and allowed a different, wider self to emerge. That is why I say the work identity may be the most important thing to let go of. If you cling to it too tightly, retirement becomes a constant comparison between the old applause and the quieter new life. The new life can never win that competition if you insist on measuring it with the wrong instrument. Your title was what you did. It was never the whole of who you were. Retirement asks you to believe that and then live it. So far I have spoken about the things I see most often. Oversized housing, ongoing support of adult children that weakens your own base, expensive toys and collections that behave like obligations, second vehicles that survive only by habit, professional identity that follows you into retirement like a shadow you are reluctant to outgrow. But these are only examples. The deeper principle is more important than the list. Retirement is not a contest in owning the maximum number of artifacts from former seasons. It is an exercise in discovering what truly belongs in the season you are actually entering. That requires a framework. Otherwise, people make decisions emotionally, then spend years rationalizing them. I prefer a cleaner method. I would ask 3 questions of anything I am considering keeping, selling, continuing, or releasing. First, does this serve my new life, or does it serve my old life? That question cuts deeper than people expect. Was this thing important because of who I was while working, raising children, managing a family schedule, traveling for business, or performing a certain identity? Or does it remain genuinely useful for who I am becoming now? A large house may have served a life full of people. Does it serve a life of 2? A second vehicle may have served a work schedule. Does it serve a slower weekly rhythm? A collection may have served a younger, self-proving competence or chasing mastery. Does it still serve actual joy, or has it become a shrine to a version of yourself you feel nervous about leaving behind? Habit answers these questions badly. Honesty answers them well. Second, what is this really costing me? Most people calculate only the visible cost. That is novice thinking. Real ownership has layers. There is the direct cost, of course, utilities, taxes, insurance, maintenance, repairs, depreciation, travel costs, fees, all the obvious invoices. Then there is opportunity cost. What could the released capital be doing inside the retirement structure if it were not trapped here? Funding travel, reducing withdrawal pressure, expanding optionality, buying time, lowering anxiety, supporting health, mobility, or family experiences that matter more now than the object itself. Then there is energy cost. This one is easily ignored and often decisive. How much mental bandwidth does this item consume? How often does it need attention? How often does it create low-grade stress? How often does it tug at your calendar? Retirement changes the value of attention. When you are working, you often do not notice the drain because the whole life is busy. Anyway, in retirement, attention becomes a more visible currency. That is one reason clutter and burden start feeling heavier. Then there is space cost. What kind of life is prevented because this thing remains? Where could you live if you did not have to house it? How could you move if you did not have to maintain it? Which options are blocked because your structure is too crowded? By the time you consider all four costs, a supposedly beloved object or habit often looks very different. Third, if I let this go, what becomes possible? This is the question that moves people from scarcity thinking to intelligent liberation. Most people ask the letting go question in a frightened way. But the better question is, what will open? What travel becomes easier? What stress disappears? What financial slack appears? What flexibility emerges? What identity becomes available? What mornings feel lighter? What decisions become simpler? How much of your actual life returns once the wrong obligation stops sitting on your chest? People are often shocked by the answer because the things they thought were supporting their happiness were quietly taxing it. That is why I like experiments. Before selling something significant, simulate the future. Live as though the house were smaller. Live as though the second car were gone. Live as though the RV boat or storage unit collection no longer existed in your life. If you can take the carrying cost and mentally place it inside your retirement account for 90 days, pretend the capital was already working for your future instead of sitting inside the object. Notice not only what you miss, but what you do not miss. Relief is data. People forget that. If you feel unexpectedly lighter, that matters. If no one reaches for the object, that matters. If the imagined loss turns out much smaller than the real data, that matters. The most successful retirees I have known are not the people with the most things. They are the people who learn the difference between what they own and what owns them. That is a crucial distinction. A person may say he owns a vacation property, but if the property dictates his calendar, his expense structure, his maintenance anxiety, and his location flexibility, the relationship is not as one-sided as the language suggests. A person may say he owns a collection, but if the collection requires more service than pleasure, then the ownership has become more mutual than he admits. A person may say she helps the children out of love, but if that help is quietly endangering the years she spent decades funding, then love has slipped across the line into self-erasure. And a person may say he still enjoys telling people who he used to be professionally. But if that old identity prevents him from discovering the richer and quieter shape of who he is becoming, then the title still owns him. Retirement is precious, partly because it is limited. That truth should not be depressing. It should be clarifying. If you are in your 60s, 70s, or even beyond, the remaining healthy years deserve protection. They should not be squandered on managing objects, identities, and obligations that fit a previous chapter better than this one. The irony is that letting go often feels like loss only in anticipation. Afterward, it frequently feels like regained oxygen. That is because simplicity creates room. Room in the budget, room in the calendar, room in the mind, room in the body, room in the relationship, room in the future. People underestimate how much energy goes into holding up a complicated life. The bigger the structure, the more maintenance it demands. Retirement can become surprisingly burdensome if complexity is allowed to remain untreated. You finish working only to discover you are still fully employed by your possessions. That is not the point of retirement. The point is not to shift from paid labor into unpaid maintenance. The point is to convert years of effort into a stage of greater freedom, better use of time, and more deliberate living. I am not advising anyone to strip life bare for the sake of austerity. That is not wisdom either. Some things truly earn their place. Some objects and commitments still deliver joy worth their cost. Some homes still fit beautifully. Some support for children is entirely appropriate. Some hobbies deserve real funding. Some second vehicles may remain sensible. Some professional abilities continue fruitfully through mentorship, part-time work, or service. Fine. The point is not to sell everything. The point is to stop assuming that everything earned under one season automatically deserves to be carried into the next. A good retirement is not an attic. It is a deliberate life. So if I were approaching retirement today, I would perform an honest audit. I would walk through the house and ask what I am really paying to keep each layer of this life intact. I would open the budget and label every major expense according to whether it supports the retirement I say I want. I would ask which commitments still generate real meaning and which merely preserve appearances or old stories. I would speak carefully with my spouse, because couples often discover that one person is attached to the memory of something while the other is quietly carrying the burden of maintaining it, I would separate sentiment from structure. Not because sentiment is worthless, because sentiment becomes dangerous when it is allowed to write checks the future must cash. Then I would make changes early enough to enjoy their benefit while health and mobility still make benefit meaningful. This is another trap people fall into. They delay simplification because change feels inconvenient now. They tell themselves they will downsize later, reduce later, unwind later, travel later, rest later, stop supporting everyone later, adjust identity later. Later is not always generous. The healthiest years of retirement are unusually valuable. They are the years when freedom is not merely theoretical but usable. That is why I prefer simplification before crisis, rather than simplification after energy has already declined. Make the move while you can enjoy the result. Make the adjustment while choice still feels expansive instead of forced. Make the sale while it feels strategic instead of desperate. The happiest retirees are not necessarily the richest. Often they are the clearest. They know what matters. They know what costs too much. They know what chapter they are in. They know which things still serve life and which things only consume it. That clarity is worth a great deal. In business, I always liked the idea of capital being allocated toward its highest and best use. Retirement deserves the same standard. Your money, your time, your attention, your energy, your remaining healthy years, all of them are capital, and all of them deserve better than being trapped inside structures that belong to yesterday. If something no longer fits, selling it is not defeat. If an obligation no longer belongs, releasing it is not selfishness. If an old identity is crowding out a truer one, letting it soften is not decline. Sometimes wisdom in retirement looks very much like subtraction. Subtraction of weight, subtraction of noise, subtraction of expense, subtraction of ego, subtraction of maintenance, subtraction of whatever no longer deserves a claim on the years you spent a lifetime trying to reach. That is how I would think about it. Not what more can I accumulate now, but what can I release? So that retirement finally feels like freedom, instead of a fully furnished continuation of everything I was trying to escape. Because in the end, the happiest people I know in retirement are not surrounded by the most proof. They are surrounded by the most room. Room to travel, room to rest, room to help where it truly matters, room to enjoy what they kept because they chose it deliberately, room to become who they are now, instead of endlessly maintaining evidence of who they used to be. That, to me, is one of the best definitions of a well-designed retirement I have ever found.